First of all, thanks for doing the podcast, Robb. I've got a lot of questions for you, and you've been a lot of help to me over the years, so I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Great.
I'm going to start with, I think, probably a more complicated one. So as you know, about 6 years ago, a little over 6 years ago, I had a stroke. And what had happened was I hadn't realized I had high blood pressure, so it had gone undiagnosed for a long time. You sent me a lot of information that was really helpful. And at the same time, I'm getting information from my doctors, and they did not match. Oftentimes it was different. Sometimes it was the same, but oftentimes it was different. And oftentimes it was almost opposite of what was going on.
Right.
Long story short, I went with your advice, and my numbers are great, and I haven't had a problem since. So nothing else has come up. But it brings up a question that part of this, I think, and this is just my guess, but part of this is the fact that medical doctors aren't experts on nutrition. I don't think they get that much training. But how's the average consumer, how's somebody like me who doesn't read on nutrition all the time, and has to sort through this kind of information, the massive amount of information that's out there, including a medical establishment which doesn't seem to have caught up really with any of the more accurate information? How do you navigate that yourself?
It's tough. I mean, it's what's a good analogy? Like, I know a little bit about computers and the way that networks work and stuff like that, but if you get a couple of computer geeks, engineers, systems people talking, like, I'm out over the ends of my skis immediately, and I'm completely in the embrace of these folks, and hopefully they're steering me right with the advice they give me. Like, let's say I have a technical topic or something, like our really specialized world. It's impossible to be an expert on everything. And I think that one thing that you can take away from this type of stuff, like if I have a computer issue and I go to a person and they say, hey, I think it's this, let's try this, and then we'll see how things go. They can kind of give you a differential diagnosis, and they can say maybe A, B, or C is going to be the result. And based off of A, B, or C, then we can kind of go from there. And I think that that's a reasonable and honest place to start the discussion of health. I'm kind of in that lower carb diet camp. I don't think it's the right tool for all situations, but man, it's a really damn good tool. Like it addresses a lot of problems within these underlying kind of metabolic syndrome conditions, like hypertension, like high blood pressure. So I think that is a way to do it. You have to kind of put your junior scientist cap on a little bit and say, okay, we're doing an experiment. We think that the situation is this. Based off the experiment, we should get these results. And part of those results is that, maybe blood pressure improves, maybe blood sugar improves, and maybe something silly happens, like the person feels way better. They're like, wow, I haven't felt this good in like 10 or 15 years. Right. Versus, in defense of kind of the standard of care medical practice, it is damnably hard to get folks to change diet and lifestyle. Like it really is an uphill slog. And doctors are really poorly positioned to be able to do anything. Like they have these really tight time schedules. They've got to turn folks over really fast. Health coaching just got introduced into the ICD-10 as a diagnostic code, so that health coaches can start potentially being documented in research and potentially reimbursed down the road. So a doctor's role should probably be to diagnose things, but people really do need support to be able to make a change. I think that this is where gyms are so fantastic for people, because they have a community and support, and they will enact diet and lifestyle changes because of the community and support that they wouldn't do as a standalone feature. So, I guess these kind of two-pronged things, like look at all of this stuff in a scientific way and have a desirable outcome. Like, I guess there are situations where going on certain meds that make you feel worse might be, at the end of the day, a favorable outcome. But if the diet and lifestyle or pharmacological interventions qualitatively decrease your lifestyle and aren't really moving important metrics of metabolic health like blood pressure and blood glucose and everything, that seems like a really honest place to be with that. And then, if we tried standard of care recommendation and we didn't really see the type of changes that we would like to see, then we could try, you know, kind of a low carb or a paleo or some sort of an ancestral health type intervention. But even in those contexts, I think it's reasonable for the person, you know, making these suggestions. It's like, if what we think is going on is this, and we change things this way, then we should see these results. And it should be very predictable. It should be very repeatable. And then the person is left with like, okay, that changed in the way I wanted it, and it was worth doing. But maybe there's a situation where the person is like, yeah, my blood pressure is better, but God, I hate my life now, and it's just not worth doing it. And then they can make a decision around that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So in that case, you're also talking about having some way you can test the results beyond not just your own subjective feeling, but also things like blood tests and things like that. Right?
Yeah.
And that brings me to next question. This is probably the thing I get asked the most when I ask people what to talk to you about, and that is nutrition for what we do for combat athletes and for jiu-jitsu. And that's going to be kind of two parts. So there's the regular, like for me, everything I do, and I know for like John Frankel's the same and others, it's about sustainability, because I want to be able to roll with my grandkids when I'm 85.
Right.
So that's what I'm concerned about. And then for some of the younger athletes, they're thinking more in terms of pre-competition hydration and diet, and or when they're having the heavy workouts that are meant to mimic the competition, then they want to do the same thing, right? So attack that either however you want, but basically two related but different goals there.
Yeah, you know, the two shouldn't be super far apart. Like the demands of a professional athlete clearly can become antagonistic towards a really longevity bias. Like there can be orthopedic issues and all kinds of things like that. But there is kind of a reality that, you know, one of the big challenges, like something that was interesting for me as a coach, I never coached people in jiu-jitsu early on, but I would do their strength and conditioning as part of their MMA and stuff like that. But my main role as a coach for those folks was to act as a speed bump so they didn't totally destroy themselves on game day. You know, oftentimes like the people willing to do MMA and really compete at high levels in wrestling and all that, they don't need a Jocko Willink like pep talk in the morning. Usually they need like a cold shower and like, dude, you got to calm down. Like you're going to be totally destroyed on game day. So, you know, within all that context, they're pushing their body and their minds to the limit. And the kind of crazy suggestion that I make is that just generally nutritionally, they should have a minimally processed whole food based diet, kind of protein centric as a beginning. We figure out if the person does better on carbs or fat or a mix, and a little bit of tinkering will tell us that. And that's really where we go. And because, you know, fighting is typically a weight class based sport, we try to keep body weight pretty close to what you're going to do. I mean, MMA is a little different because they get this, you know, 24-hour plus period to rehydrate and do all that type of stuff. Even then, I would make the case that folks would really, it would likely increase the longevity of their career to stay closer to a competition weight than not. Like those really massive weight fluctuations are pretty rough, but you know, stay reasonably close to fighting shape throughout the year. You don't need to be neurotic about it, but you know, a fight camp should just kind of like hone things. It shouldn't be that we're taking you from the couch and you know, completely trying to rebuild you from scratch. But you know, big picture, the nutrition, minimally processed whole food type diet, I find some people do really well on higher carb, lower fat. Some people the exact opposite. The low carb stuff is interesting in the context of a combat sport because it really is a glycolytic sport. So it's very high intensity, but some people do okay with a lower carbohydrate intake on that. They find that they maintain a little bit better body composition. They don't get the blood sugar highs and lows that are kind of typified by a more a higher carb or a more refined carb diet.
Right.
But that's stuff that, you know, if somebody's really taking their training seriously, this is something that you do in the really early pre-competition phases where you do some nutritional tinkering. You fiddle with those levers of protein, carbs, fat to kind of see where you feel good. And then the worst thing that somebody could do is really change something drastically as they get closer to game day, you know? So like try to get a serial killer consistency around nutrition, sleep, restoration, like very, very consistent, understand what the feedback response is around all that. And then I guess you mentioned the hydration. Like, I think that is a piece that folks don't take nearly as seriously as they should. Just within ACSM guidelines, American Council of Sports Medicine guidelines, those folks, and this will depend on like a really large athlete versus a smaller athlete and whatnot, but their general recommendations are to consume at least 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day for an athlete that is training at high intensity, high temperature, and or high humidity, which, you know, grappling, MMA, it's always hot, it's always humid, it's always high intensity. So I think that is a major piece that folks are missing, is the electrolyte story, in particular sodium. Like, people think a lot about potassium and magnesium, and they are really important. But when we're physically active, when we sweat, we don't really excrete much potassium or magnesium. We excrete huge amounts of sodium. Some of the work that we've done with NHL players, these bigger guys will lose 10 pounds of water in a game or a hard training session and 10 grams of sodium during that time. Yeah. And then going back to like standard of care, the standard medical advice is that people shouldn't consume more than 2 grams of sodium in a day. Right. So you may have like a 5-fold deficiency in the amount of sodium that you need. And the symptoms of that: lethargy, brain fog, poor reaction time. And then cramping is when you are really far down the rabbit hole of being sodium depleted specifically. So if you're experiencing cramps, you've gone so far down the sodium depletion story that it honestly is dangerous. I mean, the kind of ultimate cramp that you can get is a heart cramp, and low sodium can play into that. So, you know, that's where the hydration piece, it was kind of cool. I got to go on Lance Armstrong's podcast, and he you know, very accomplished athlete, whatever else people think about, you know, the rest of his life. But he made the point that he doesn't view triathlon as a 4-sport endeavor or a 3-sport endeavor. He sees it as a 4-sport endeavor. And the fourth sport is nutrition and hydration. And he was emphatic about that. And I thought that was a really remarkable insight, and not dissimilar from Greg Glassman, who's the founder of CrossFit, who in their pyramid, their hierarchy of what they want to develop, they had nutrition, you know, the molecular basis of our function, as the foundation. Right. And then they got into different layers of the training from there.
Right. That's super interesting. So you basically just described me, because I'm 260 pounds. And when I roll for an hour, I God knows how much I sweat, like the whole mat. Right. Covered. So I've been using LMNT. We're selling that at the gym. I got introduced to that by Ray Price when I came back from an overseas flight in Ireland, and I went to go train in Reno, and it was hot. And yep. after we rolled, he gave me one. He's like, try this. I immediately felt better. But so I have some context, because I'm sure I'm losing 10 grams of sodium when I roll. What am I getting back with 1 packet of Element?
You get 1 gram of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and then 60 milligrams of magnesium. And we formulated it that way because we're really encouraging people to get the bulk of their electrolytes from a minimally processed diet, okay, which should provide pretty good amounts of potassium and magnesium. But even when people really salt their food, like I suffered from this for years, I would salt my food pretty aggressively. But when I finally weighed and measured how much total electrolytes I was taking in, I was around 2 grams of sodium per day, which was really like my good operating level is somewhere between 5 and 8 grams of sodium, depending on what environment I'm in.
You know, the number one thing the doctors, when I had my stroke, were harping on me about, the whole system that they had basically was cutting all salt out. That's what they wanted to do. So in that case, actually having 1 element after I work out is probably not enough. I'm probably going to need to drink it before and after, and probably 2 or 3 a day, right?
Yeah. And we also, like, the way that this whole thing got started is we really recognized that within different communities, folks were super electrolyte deficient. And so we put together a make it yourself home electrolyte brew. We called it Keto Aid, and we still have it available on Element. And it's, this much sodium chloride, this much potassium chloride, which you can find that in the store. It's just called no salt, a little bit of magnesium citrate, lemon juice, stevia, shake it up and use that. And when we put it out on our social media channels, 6 months later, we had 500,000 downloads, and people were just raving about how much better they felt, how much better they were performing. They were doing pre, during, and post. And that post part is really interesting. Like, if people are, sometimes you get that kind of like neuro fatigue after a really hard session and you just feel blown out. I think a lot of it is electrolyte driven. There was actually a pretty interesting paper recently that suggested that sodium loading post exercise accelerates that recovery piece. And, in your situation too, the sodium hypertension story is interesting. Usually we find that related to some elevated insulin levels, like some hyperinsulinemia. But what's interesting about that, so somebody that is overtly like hypertensive or a sodium sensitive hypertensive, we wouldn't necessarily want to throw something like Element at that person straight out of the gate. But that person is also probably not going to show the signs and symptoms of electrolyte depletion because their body tends to retain more sodium in that hypertensive state. But then if they clean up their diet, they sleep better, then their insulin levels drop, and then we tend to then excrete more sodium. And that's where you would need to potentially supplement on top of that. And, one of this is one of the confounders about the advice that physicians would give in this situation. There have been great studies looking at sodium restricted diets, and they don't really change blood pressure that much. Like, it's a little bit here and there, and there's a greater magnitude, based off of ethnicity and things like that. But it's really underwhelming. But one of the key characteristics that we see with a marked dietary shift is, and this is whether somebody just goes standard American diet to Mediterranean or, whatever, but kind of the lower the carb, the more the effect. We tend to see a really powerful diuretic effect, like that excess blood volume that's causing the hypertension tends to be a direct consequence of getting better diet and lifestyle dialed in, getting those insulin levels to normal, healthy physiological bounds. And then that part kind of normalizes. But again, ironically, then people oftentimes find that they might need to supplement more sodium in that because they're not retaining so much.
Couple questions. You mentioned the importance of sleep, and I love Jocko. I'm a fan of what he's done for jiu-jitsu and everything else, but there's a lot of guys that are operating on 4 or 5 hours of sleep now. And I can't do that personally. If I get less than 8 hours of sleep, I feel like a zombie the next day. But how important is sleep, and how much sleep should the average person or the athlete be getting?
It's funny. A good friend of mine, Kirk Parsley, is also a retired Navy SEAL. He knows Jocko really well. He introduced us like right before Jocko kind of hit the big time. And ironically, he's a retired SEAL, but also a physician. And he was taking care of all the medical concerns of the West Coast SEALs. And so much of what he saw initially, so when he was a SEAL, he was kind of a pre-9/11 SEAL. And most of the problems that those guys experienced were kind of orthopedic issues. It was like a triathlete, like they run, kind of run, bike, swim, overuse stuff. And Kirk has this story that the first day that he was at the command there in Coronado as the dive officer for, the West Coast SEAL teams, he had 2 guys come to him. And ultimately what their problem related back to was sleep issues. Like, one guy had filled a diesel rig with like gas, or a gas rig with diesel, because he just wasn't paying attention. And Kirk was like, well, are you sleeping okay? And the guy's like, oh, it's okay. And, well, what are you doing? I take like 4 Ambien and I chase it with a 5th of whiskey, and Kirk's like, oh my God, like that's enough to kill like 20 people, if you're not habituated to this stuff. And I forget the story on the other guy, but day one, the 2 people that came through his door, they clearly had these really disordered sleep patterns. And it was like an 8-year period of Kirk digging in, and like, these guys were experiencing kind of hypogonadism, like a lower testosterone levels because of low-level traumatic brain injuries, like just deploying a parachute is a low-level TBI. Firing a 50 caliber rifle is a low-level TBI. You know, there's all this stuff that they experience. And then the really like as pronounced a shift work as you could get, you know, being deployed, you know, 12 or 15 time zones away, staying up all night, sometimes doing go pills to stay up and then doing Ambien to go down, which Ambien makes you unconscious. It doesn't really make you sleep. Mm-hmm. And what he found is that these folks, you know, just the toughest of the tough people that we have in our society would eventually break. And when they broke, it was always around this sleep story. And everything that he did to try to help them had to augment and improve or button up their sleep. And, you know, typically, I'm blanking on the other sleep specialist's name, but he cites a study that maybe about 1 person in a million legitimately operates fine at like that 4 to 6 hours of sleep per night. But by and large, most people, like, they really optimally, you know, operate at that 8.5, 9 hours of sleep per night. And anything short of that, you are basically going to the ATM machine, the credit, you know, processing in your body, and you're taking out. And Kirk has another great analogy, which is when we're in our teens and 20s, each time we go to sleep, we wake up and we're a little bit better than what we were the day before. Like if we're training, if we're learning, you know, like our cellular integrity, like everything's a little better, everything's a little better. And you hit kind of mid-20s heading into 30s, and it kind of flatlines. But from there, we start experiencing this kind of inevitable decline into aging. And probably the number one determinant of how severe that decline is, to what magnitude that occurs, is the amount and quality of sleep that we get. And so it's, if I could redo my whole career, go back 20 years and start everything over again, I would have couched everything in the terms of sleep, because diet is a religious war every single time, like, you know, vegans versus paleo and this and that. Whereas the probably 60 or 70% of what I talk about anyway is sleep and circadian biology related, because it's just so critical. It's so non-negotiable. And then I could have backed into the nutrition. You know, it's like, well, your sleep is still disturbed. Maybe you're having high blood sugar at night, so let's reduce your carbohydrate load, and we'll back into it that way. And so it would be fascinating if I could do an A/B experiment in a parallel universe and see what my career would look like. It may not be any better or impactful, but I would have had a lot less fights had I just couched everything in the terms of, you know, let's get some good quality sleep and then go from there. But I could make the case that sleep is more important than nutrition. It gets dodgy because, I mean, if you're drinking, you know, 72 ounce sodas and everything, like, you know, you can overwhelm that. But it's funny because on the one hand, we really want heroes like Jocko in our culture. You need something like that to aspire to, and discipline is freedom. I am completely an adherent of that whole notion. But man, I want Jocko around for a long time, and I would love to see his morning wake up picture be 6:30 and not 4:30. You know, I'd love to see that happen sooner as opposed to later. But I guess a little bit of that is dependent. Like if he's going to bed at 8 p.m., then maybe it's okay. Maybe he's still getting that 8 hours of sleep. But most people don't. They have family, they have you know, different obligations. And even if they are super disciplined, it's difficult to get that. And I know I bounced around a lot there, but I just can't emphasize enough how critical sleep is. And this is another thing for people that are really interested in competition at a high level. When sleep starts getting disturbed due to the volume and the intensity of training, that's one of the first kind of canaries in the coal mine about maybe we need to pump the brakes on the volume and intensity and really get a handle back on that. Because if you don't, all of the recovery occurs later. Like you can blister yourself in the gym. And this is even at like a motor learning level. Like if you're trying to learn a new technique, or, you know, trying to set up combinations in a striking game or something like that, if you don't sleep, it doesn't imprint in your brain. Like you literally just wasted that time. So people should, I think, look at, if we were learning a language or something like that, they would be more amenable to this idea that we need sleep.
Mhm.
But when we start talking about physical tasks and physical ability, they somehow decouple the motor learning and the neurological part of that. But that is where you consolidate memories, and you want that to be as effective as you can. Clearly, you want to get as most out of a training session as you can. And that sleep is just so powerful, so non-negotiable. And you can see that retrograde performance when people sleep inadequately.
Yeah, you'd say that's probably the first sign of overtraining, right?
Yeah.
My wife had a question too. So she's been reading a book. Some of the other women in SBG have been reading a book called War, and one of the things they talk about that was the woman who wrote it, I believe it's a woman, does not recommend low or no carb diets for women because she says due to hormones and how their body uses carbs, it's a bad idea. And then she's tried it a couple times and she really didn't feel good. And I know that your recommendation is always we got to play with it and see which one. But in general, is it safe to say that women have a harder time with the lower carb diets than men?
So women will show symptoms and signs and symptoms of inappropriate nutrition sooner than men. And it's a great evolutionary wiring. Like our contribution to reproduction is super transient, whereas the woman's investment is very long-term. And so anything, whether it's overtraining, inadequate calories, inadequate potentially carbohydrate, like they are really going to notice that more profoundly. Where I see this really go sideways is honestly back at the electrolyte story. Most of the problem that I see is when folks go low carb. So like if somebody's put on a medically supervised ketogenic diet, this is where one circumstance like standard of care really gets it right. Somebody is epileptic. They're going to try a ketogenic diet to deal with the epilepsy. That dietitian will make sure that the individual gets at least 5 grams of sodium from both dietary and supplemental sources per day. So much of what we see as the hormonal dysregulation, like the downregulation of thyroid, disordered estrogen, that looks super similar to the stress of low sodium too. And what's interesting about that is when we increase carbohydrate, we tend to retain more sodium. So is it a too little carbohydrate story or is it a too little, sodium story? So I do think that women show the signs and symptoms of that problem more frequently. And, honestly, a couple of years ago, I was more nervous about women tinkering with lower carb diets. But when we really looked at the outcomes of folks diligently getting their electrolytes addressed, like I'm much, much less concerned about that. Now, all that said, it's definitely not a one size fits all thing. Like ketogenic diets are so popular these days where people drop their carbs to like 20 or 30 grams of carbohydrate per day. They've gotten so popular that people forget that there's this whole spectrum of just kind of lower carb. The food guidelines would recommend somebody Salome size to eat 200 grams of carbs a day. And I honestly think for most people, it's too much. I think that that itself can create some problems. But man, she might do great at 75 or 100. But the keto crazies say, well, that's way too many carbs because they've got kind of their worldview on it. And then the standard dietetics model would freak out because that's less than half the carbs that they're normally eating. But then if we look at, French or Spanish diets and stuff like that, like it's kind of in that ballpark. So even within westernized, but, kind of more whole food based dietary approaches, it's really not that crazy. So I would remind folks that there's a huge spectrum that you can play with in carbohydrate capping. Like don't get trapped into it's like that lower is better. But also at the same time, keep in mind that inadequate sodium can look a lot like the same problems as inadequate carbohydrate. And maybe addressing both of those, again, tinkering with figuring out what you need under different circumstances is where things kind of optimize.
And to distinguish between the two, I guess you'd have to supplement with sodium, right? To see how you'd feel and that same.
Yeah.
In which case, so for somebody Salome size, how many elements should she be drinking a day if that's what she's using?
That is like, so first I would hope that she gets as much of her electrolytes and her nutrition from her food. And let's say she was eating on the lower carb side of things. If she gets 10 olives at a meal, that's a gram of sodium. If she does, part of her protein allotment is some good quality salami, that's a gram and a half of sodium. Pickles are a great source of sodium. So I would try to construct her diet such that she gets as much of that as possible from diet and food, so she gets all the other nutrition with it. And then I would use the element kind of supplementally. The exact amount is really hard to tell. Like if we find ourselves down at Henry's Costa Rica camp and it's 98 degrees and 95% humidity, she's probably going to do 5 of them in a day. If it's middle of the winter in Portland, she might do 1, maybe 2 of them, because of training, assuming that she's getting that good sodium from the diet.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned too, I remember when I first met you, which I was trying to think, this must have been 23 years ago, I think. It may have been, I don't know if it was 99 or 98 when you were in Chico with John.
Yeah.
And, at that time you were doing CrossFit. And at this time now, years later, as you look back, there's things about that model that everybody likes, but there's the major criticism that I hear all the time from other trainers is injuries. Is that fair when we're talking about CrossFit?
I think it's super fair. And we kind of got kicked out because we were talking about stuff like that. Like we ran so I co-founded the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world. The first one was up in Seattle, and then the fourth one was down there in Chico. And it didn't take us long to figure out that we needed some sort of an onboarding process. Like even a well-accomplished athlete just coming off the street, they were not ready for like high rep Olympic lifts and just the volume and intensity that is kind of implicit in CrossFit. And, one of the fascinating things is writing people's name on a chalkboard and then trying to make sure that you don't come in dead fucking last. Like it will really motivate people, but people will murder themselves to not come in last and try to have a good performance. And it was a beautiful insight on Greg Glassman's part on the one hand, but it's really powerful medicine. And it took us a while to figure out, like, we need a really dedicated onboarding program that included like a small group, 6-week process where they were exposed to both the movements and incrementally increasing intensity, or they needed personal training and they needed some amount of that till they progressed to the next level. And even when they were in the general group classes, we had like a level 1 that didn't include any Olympic lifts at all. People needed to go to the Olympic lifting class, get competency in those movements, pass a competency test, and then they could graduate into level 2. And we were one of the only gyms that our trainers were full-time. They got a 401k, they had medical benefits because we kept enough people in the gym to be able to do that. And as well as I do, like running a service-based business and having any margins to do anything like that, like you've got to be really on point. And so like every person who comes in the front door, man, they're valuable. And it sounds like it may be bad in a way, but the trying to make as good of a business financially as we could, I think really transitioned into dramatically improving the training that we offered. Like it would have been easier as a coach to just throw people in the class and the strong survive, but we would have never. You can keep the lights on with that, but you'll never pay yourself. You'll never be able to pay a staff. You'd never buy the building that your business is in. And it's an unfortunate, it's a really unfortunate missed opportunity that more of that thinking and culture didn't permeate into CrossFit when it was on its growth cycle. I think some of that is kind of backfilling now, but now CrossFit oftentimes has a little bit of a mixed feeling from people. It doesn't just scream quality. It doesn't scream high standards. Usually it screams pain and suffering. And
Right.
That's kind of that's a tough effigy to kind of peel off and run with.
What's interesting about that is you just described exactly the process, kind of evolution that we went through with SBG about 12 years ago. It's the exact same thing with the onboarding process. takes about the same amount of time. And initially I made most of those changes, as did the other gym owners, for business reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But very quickly I realized, hey, if I was a billionaire and I wasn't going to charge anybody anything, I'd still do it exactly the same way, because the students actually end up becoming better and more competent quicker, and in a way that's much safer. So yeah, that makes 100% sense. Is there any difference? I'm asking this one for Paul Sharp, because he did ask me. He's probably the only guy that's going to ask this question in SBG, but he's started to get into endurance training.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything different that you would do for endurance training that than what you described for jiu-jitsu type, combat athlete type training?
Not really, other than Zach Bitter is an interesting example. He has the world record in the 100-mile indoor track. They just run around a track and run 100 miles. And he said, mentally it's almost worse than the physical part, because you got to go around that thing like 400 times or whatever to do it. But when you think about the fueling needs of endurance versus power athletes, and I would put like combatives in that power athlete story, the longer the duration goes out, the less reliant people are on glycogen as a fuel source. And so I could make the case that the longer the duration of the event, the more you could lean into that fat-fueled kind of process and maybe drop in targeted carbs here and there. Like even Zach on that 100-mile race, he dropped in some carbs, but he was mainly fat-fueled, like quite low carb during that whole process. So that just is a thing that you can look at to see if that provides some benefit, quicker recovery, lower inflammation, and then possibly just building that very fat fuel gear. Phil Maffetone is a world famous running coach, and there's he did a lot of research in like what heart rate should you train at to be kind of optimally fat and oxygen fueled to avoid going into that glycolytic state, because when you start redlining, that's when fatigue really accumulates. And for folks going longer than like a 45-minute effort, like that really becomes important. So he develops all this heart rate training and breathing and kind of a fat-fueled approach. He would like you to be able to run at a faster and faster pace, but maintain the same heart rate. And basically, there's ways of kind of training up to that. And clearly, there's a limit to it at some point. But what they find is that those folks are able to take their capacity to run primarily off of fat and really increase that. And then if you have a hill you have to climb, if you have a sprint you have to do, that will be glycogen fueled. But if most of your lower paced activity is fat fueled, you still have that glycogen reserve. This is the problem that people run into with like a marathon. When they fully deplete their glycogen stores, then they hit the wall and bonk. And I guess all the same caveats there for Paul on the electrolyte side. Like I would really play a lot with electrolyte timing, amounts, and whatnot to maintain all of that. Particularly again, heat, elevation, humidity, all of those things dramatically increase electrolyte need. And typically when people are hydrating in the field, they're just focusing on water, or they're using some sort of an electrolyte product that just really is underpowered on the sodium side, because that is the main thing you're missing. People would be well served to just do like salt water relative to just plain water in a really long-term endurance activity like that.
Is Pedialyte also underpowered on sodium?
Yeah. If you were to take some Pedialyte and then like if you had 1 liter and then you did half a teaspoon of sodium in that and shook it up, that would be pretty good, because you have a decent amount of glucose and then you would have that sodium at about the right ratio. So that would be something like if you're just in a hurry and you need something, doing like the 1 liter of Pedialyte and then a half a teaspoon of table salt, which will provide about 1 gram of sodium, that would be a pretty good option. Yeah.
So what does a diet so somebody who's going to be working on fat fuel, what does a diet look like? How different is that diet? Give me a typical meal for somebody like that.
Oh man, I mean, like bacon and eggs and maybe a little bit of fruit for breakfast. If they're really training hard, maybe they're doing like some macadamia nuts or almonds to kind of puff up the fat. Some sort of a salad for lunch that again you would be really generous with pouring the olive oil on it. Maybe you're doing some fatty fish like sardines or salmon to kind of puff the fat up. Lots of olives again because you're getting sodium and you're getting some good fats there. And then kind of similar stuff for dinner. And maybe doing a little bit of like whole cream in the coffee and things like that. There were a few years ago, the bulletproof coffee craze kind of went wild, and you had people dissolving a whole stick of butter in a cup of coffee, and they couldn't believe that they were getting fat from that, and that their cholesterol and triglycerides went crazy when they're eating like 800 calories of butter in a serving. If you're a Sherpa at altitude on Everest, go for that. But most people are not. So
I'm still using a little bit, like a half a teaspoon of MCT oil. Still a good idea.
The MCT oil is great, so long the danger with that, if you use too much, you get disaster pants. So that is super self-limiting. Yeah. But yeah, the MCT is cool. And that's something I forget to mention. Even if somebody's eating kind of a moderate to higher carb diet, dropping in some MCTs, the body can't store MCT as a fat. So it has to burn it. And the way that it burns it is converting them into ketone bodies, and then the ketone bodies are oxidized. So it's a way that you can get an appreciable bump in ketone levels despite eating an otherwise, kind of higher carb diet. And a lot of performance-oriented folks figure out how to get that air-fuel mixture right, because it's pretty legit. Like, you're getting some benefit from that enhanced ketone level. Oftentimes people notice that they're cognitively a little more sharp with the ketones available, but then they also have their glycogen stores topped off. So you get a little bit of the best of both worlds with that if you can get the dosing correct.
That's interesting. I didn't realize you couldn't store it. Is that the reason for that negative side effect if you take too much?
I think so. Like, the body definitely limits how much you can absorb. Yeah.
When we were in Montana, I guess about a month ago, we had a really interesting conversation. And at the risk of getting my own podcast canceled, I do want to talk about it, because to me it's really concerning. And I find myself getting more and more concerned about it every time I watch the news every day. But do you want to talk about what happened with you and Google overnight, you and Google and Facebook?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't want to do it too much as a woe is me thing, but it is a little bit of a woe is me. And this was a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now. And so I've had a decently well-placed website, a blog, since 2009, 2010. It's not like a top 100, but I got a lot of traffic. It generated huge amounts of content on a variety of topics. Like one of them, there's a vegan documentary film called What the Health, and it's super popular, very, very influential. And I did a piece where I went through, literally timestamp minute by minute. Here's what the film claims. Here's my take on it. Here's their citations. Here's my citations. It was like 90 hours of work. And I want to say it was like a 22,000 word piece that I put together. And this very popular vegan documentary, if you searched What the Health, you would typically find their website and then maybe a link or two. And then my review was right up there at the top. And I had hundreds of pages like this, addressing different topics that basically I would get like kind of front page Google return. And we had built a business around all this. And we got up one day and it was just gone. Like 97% of our site traffic was gone. If you looked at that, What the Health, where normally I would be on page 1 of Google, you couldn't even find my page. And so I wasn't deplatformed in that my website was taken down, but unless you knew to put in Robb Wolf, What the Health, you would never find that thing. Or, Robb Wolf, chronic kidney disease and ketogenic diets, all of that organic search traffic kind of disappeared. We had no idea what happened. And about a week and a half went by, and then a couple of news pieces came out where they mentioned that my website and about 30 or 40 other websites that are in this kind of ancestral health space had received kind of similar treatment. Like basically there had been some very strategic pruning of the links back to these sites. And some of the people are pretty controversial, like Joseph Mercola. He's a pretty well-known alternative medicine doctor. This guy, Sayer G. I'm blanking on some of the other people. Some of these folks are pretty controversial. Like they're very anti-vaccine. They are in the 5G causes cancer scene, which I'm not anti-vax. I am concerned that my daughter had a vaccine reaction. I would still vaccinate my kids, but she had a dermatological reaction that still gives her problems to this day. But I've always tried to have as evidence-based and science-based a perspective as I can on this stuff, which means that it evolves and grows and whatnot. But there was some interesting overlap. Most of the people that were it's not deplatforming, but that had their strings trimmed. They were in kind of this lower carb space, and some of them were more in this kind of anti-vaccine. Some of them were more in this like 5G causes cancer scene. But there were some other folks that I would say, like myself, that were, I think, pretty grounded. Definitely look at things in a different way, not totally in line with the standard medical care across the board, but I think also usually cited some decent evidence-based literature to be able to at least make a case around the point that I was at. And it was a scary process, because in losing 97% of your site traffic, you also lose about 97% of your income overnight. And so we had to we moved out of Reno. We pulled some money out of our house and some investments, and we realized that we did not want to be in a position where the tech platforms could just make you go away overnight. And so we moved all of our activity for the most part onto this platform called Mighty Networks, and built a community there called the Healthy Rebellion. And interestingly, the whole COVID pandemic and the toxicity of social media, it's been a huge boon for us. Like we had a massive influx of people there just wanting to find a place to get healthy and to have good community and have it function in a way that wasn't as toxic as the social media environment. But we were very early to this kind of cancel scene. And we talked a little bit about this when you were up in Montana, but there's some interesting connections between the social media platforms and different pharmaceutical companies. Google and GlaxoSmithKline had an exchange of like $600 million. And I forget which direction it went, but they've had enough interaction with pharmaceutical companies that there was an interesting Forbes piece that made the case that we should look at Google as a pharma or biotech entity. Like this is definitely something that they are super interested in. And it's definitely something that they are really interested in controlling the messaging around. And I'm not going to say that like low carb diets can solve all problems, but when you look at the bulk of the diseases that afflict Western civilization, it is metabolically driven. And although there's a variety of ways, like vegan diets can address it, there's lots of ways to do it. But this low carb stuff is sticky. Like it works remarkably well. People get some pretty good adherence on it. For the first time in recent history, sugary soda beverages sold in the United States had decreased. The breakfast cereal sales had decreased. And so there's been these really non-trivial social shifts that have occurred. And they attributed it largely to the popularity of ketogenic and paleo type diets and people buying into that. And I don't know that it's as conspiracy theory driven as like pharma and technology wants us to be sick so they can sell us products, but it also doesn't look super far away from that too. So I don't know if I'm wandering at this point, but that was our experience. But we were very, very early in kind of the cancel scene, and we were clearly being shadow banned on the Facebook and Instagram platforms. Like we could tell that based off of our attempt at selling things like our keto masterclass and whatnot. Like we just our engagement with people plummeted right around this time. It was just gutted.
Interesting to me because they they didn't say a word to you about it, but you
No,
could tell,
no.
you could tell because you were watching your numbers, and that just happened overnight. And what was the
Yeah.
product? Just your normal product?
Yeah, this thing called the Keto Masterclass, which is just a how to do a ketogenic diet. And I mean, it's clearly I'm biased, but it's really good. It's very thorough. Like we had, it was selling really, really well. We had a nice process of getting testimonials around it. Like people just raved about it. They would tell people about it. They're like, this thing is so easy. Like, and I took, 20 years of my career and condensed it into this course to try to help people solve the challenges they had, including figuring out if a ketogenic diet just wasn't right for them.
Sure.
It wasn't just do a ketogenic diet, but here's a differential you can do and figure out, okay, if you've done all of this, if your electrolytes are on point, you've done this, you've done that, and you're still struggling, let's go this other direction. So it wasn't pretty comprehensive. It was a pretty good product. It was selling well. It's right in a niche that, was very popular, weight loss and all that. And what was fascinating is it went from selling really well to just kind of flatlining. And then it got to a point where we could sell it for just about exactly what we put into it for ads, but nothing more. And I think I mentioned to you that we turned this thing over to the largest Facebook ad agency in the world. And they're like, oh, we can sell the pants off this. And they tinkered and tried. And at the end of the day, they're like, you guys are being shadow banned. Like we should be able to sell the pants off this thing, but they couldn't.
So theoretically, as someone who loves the free market, as I know you do, they should be interested in selling as many advertisements to you as possible. So what is their interest that overwhelmed that dollar amount? Do you think it's the same thing? Are we talking about pharma?
5 years ago, I would have thought that was really crazy conspiracy theory stuff. But Matt, that's the only thing I can kind of come up with. And as we've seen COVID kind of roll out and the messaging around the vaccines and then the kind of truncheon approach around the vaccines, it sure seems like there's something else to all of that. It's not as simple as like squash the pandemic, because then we would be tracking, well, who's had COVID, and let's document those folks, and they're part of the herd immunity. And, it would be a much more comprehensive picture. I think I did a podcast back in late March or early April of 2020, I guess, where I said, if vaccines are the only solution, they're not really interested in really solving this problem. Like you don't tackle complex problems with a singular solution. Like you need a multi-pronged approach, and it needs to be really nuanced and everything. And so I started getting some weird vibes on that. And I wish I had something other than like, oh, it's big pharma, because that seems so easy to dismiss because it sounds like nuttery and conspiracy theory and everything. But when I just run it through the filter of who would I need to be, or what would I need to be thinking about to do what Facebook did. Like we were selling a lot of product, and Facebook makes lots of money, but we were making them lots of money doing this thing. So why would you purposefully curtail that success? You've got to have some sort of a bigger endpoint that one is playing to. And the only thing I can think of is pharma.
Yeah. Do you think it could also be some room full of millennials who have in their mind that they know better than anybody else, and somehow you've been boxed into some alt medicine group that they feel is dangerous, and they push the button on that?
That very well could be, and that actually is probably more credible and probably much more likely. And an interesting side piece to that is that the topic of animal husbandry and climate change is a really big deal. And I wrote a book and did a film called Sacred Cow that talks about the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of meat-inclusive food system. And based off the research we did, which we spent 5 years doing it, doesn't mean that it's all right, but we did a really thorough job on it. But it really makes the case that animal husbandry as it relates to climate change is probably really overblown, and that properly raised grazing animals in a holistic fashion may actually play a mitigating effect in climate change. Mm-hmm. And that messaging gets people in trouble immediately, because it becomes this kind of weird game of whack-a-mole where on the one hand, it's like, well, they're alt medicine, so that's dangerous. oh, they're also suggesting that animals aren't causing climate change. And so there's certainly a climate change denier, and climate change deniers are also racist. And it just, man, it really, it snowballs rapidly from that. And so I actually kind of like your thoughts on that better. And we know from some of the documents, leaked internally and whatnot, that it is oftentimes just some like 22, 24-year-old tech engineer that is tasked with like monitoring this section of stuff. And if they just kind of politically don't agree with it, and they're clearly not, they're unlikely to be well steeped in the topic, but it just seems off-putting or onerous, or it's not consistent with the standard dogma, then those folks are incentivized to put the clamps on something like my Facebook presence or my Google ranking and whatnot.
Yeah, I find that really disturbing. I forget what it was, a month or two ago, when the Biden administration said that they were going to help Facebook and Google handle fake news, and they have a guy that
a list.
They have a list, and they have a person who's directly working with them in the administration from the White House. Which, how that didn't generate more news or anything from our Mockingbird media, I'll never know, because to me that's really disconcerting and dangerous. And
that's supposed to be everything that they're not doing. That's the thing that you deny at all costs. And the fact that they actually came out and said, yeah, this is what we're doing, it was kind of like, because that was also kind of that last dividing line between like a platform and a publisher and like First Amendment and stuff like that, which the tech company had played both sides of the fence very effectively on that. And then when the US government comes out and says, oh no, we're collaborating with these guys to make sure that we get this thing right, then that whole distinction of publisher and platform and everything just went away. It's like, no, this is an arm of the government now. Yeah.
And clearly a First Amendment violation. But
yeah,
given what it is, and given the fact that I don't see that changing anytime soon, because I see a good portion of the public doesn't even acknowledge it. I'll try and end on an optimistic note if possible, but what solutions would you have, especially for, there's a lot of people nowadays who are entering into where a lot of how they feed their family is based on online businesses. And what would you recommend to people to be able to kind of protect themselves and insulate themselves from these technocratics, authoritarians taking over the messaging for the entire world? How do we protect ourselves from that?
Man, I noodle on that a lot. And I think having an email list, even as old school as it seems, like that was the way that we were able to pivot and then spin up this healthy rebellion community, was just generating an email list, because that is a group of people that are typically pretty engaged with you and really believe in what type of stuff you're doing. If you're going to have some sort of an online presence, like something like Mighty Networks might not be a bad idea. Gina Bianchini, who is the CEO for Mighty Networks, has struck me as being pretty libertarian in stance, just in that, like, she wants people to be free to do the things that they want to do. Now, if somebody's inciting violence and stuff like that, then yes, by all means, like, we need to address that. But she has struck me as being really level-headed and kind of a fairly ardent believer in freedom and stuff like that. I think podcasts are an interesting circumvention around a lot of that currently. And I've been honestly a little bit surprised there hasn't been more pinching of that. And maybe it's just because the distribution system, like it's harder to address. And also, I think podcasts are less likely to go specifically viral versus like a really well-crafted or punchy like Instagram post. It can reach a ton of people. So maybe they've been less interested in that. But a podcast, an email list, thinking about a platform where you aggregate your community. And also these platforms, they feel a little bit archaic. Like it's kind of some elements of Facebook, some elements of an old forum and a blog kind of got married together. And in some ways, it's kind of like both the best and worst of all of them. Like the user interface is a little clunky, but the thing that's not happening is there's not an algorithm just inciting people to attack each other. And within the rebellion, we've had some pretty spicy discussions around COVID and different things. And we did write up some community guidelines about how to interact and what would be tolerated and what wouldn't. And, we just don't need anybody doing a Biden meme or a Trump meme. Like I made that was the number one thing. It's like, there's literally a billion other places to do that. We're not going to do that here, you know? But if we have discussions around health or, you know, the way this is going to affect health, and that can be broad, you know, like, should my kids be wearing a mask when they go to school, and, you know, developmental things like that's reasonable. So I think putting some thought into like a community guideline, and I'd be willing to share what we have if people want to use that as a template. I think that those are pretty good places to start. And, you know, we just moved to Montana recently, and although I've had good success and I'm very fortunate for having been in this online world, I'm really trying to figure out how to plug back into my local community, you know, like really providing value to the straight blast gyms here and to the police, military, and fire within our local areas. I was talking with my wife, Nikki, and I was like, you know, one way that we could circumvent this is if we did everything at a local level such that the phone book was resurrected. Like, you had to pick up a phone book instead of, you know, searching it. You know, if we could do some stuff like that. So the bugger about that is you know, being online, somebody could be into like mid 18th century quilt making, and they could aggregate throughout the whole planet 10,000 people that are into that. And so, you know, they could give it a go. Whereas just doing it at a local level, like you know, it's more difficult. So there's still that ability to scale unique niche ideas that are you know, specific to the internet and the social media presence and all that.
Maybe you can still collect the ways to contact those people and then just shift them over to your more private enterprise where you can have a more open conversation.
Yeah. And that's what we do. Like our podcast, I'm trying to provide value to people, but then we market the Healthy Rebellion, and we mention the resets that we do and all that type of stuff. And then that will kind of funnel people into the rebellion. And we still post on social media, but I don't really interact with or comment much on social media, but I do still try to provide some value added content so that people will check it out. And they're like, well, if I want to, you know, go deeper on it, then there's this opportunity to do it. And it'd be interesting to run an A/B test. Like, how would our community have grown absent COVID? Like, COVID really injected fire into people looking for, you know, a safe place to talk and hash out complex, oftentimes emotional topics and try to get some credible health information. Like, I couldn't have written a better, you know, set of circumstances to grow that thing than having COVID happen. But I think that there was that need anyway. You know, that was definitely a real need. Yeah.
Sure. Well, so I think most people in the SBG know you, but for anybody that hasn't had contact with you before, they're interested in getting some of this information. Where do you want to send them?
Main place to check out is robbwolf.com. There's a link to everything. There's a link to Element and all that in there too. Awesome.
We'll definitely put that in the notes as well. And I want to thank you again, Robb. It's been super helpful for me. It always is. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Anytime you want me to bring down property values, I will do it. Thank you, Matt.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Robb.
Thanks.